So here we are, our first episode of the book club of Johnson at 10, covering chapter 1, Rise. And we'll be getting into that momentarily. But first of all, a bit of groundskeeping. These won't be regular. I'll try and keep them regular, but like I say, when you're sort of going through, when you going through this book and you've got to cover all the stuff that's said, make notes, put it into a document, and then get that document into something that's good that I can sort of read while I'm sort of going through this, and sort of bring you my thoughts. It takes a while. So I haven't done anything like that since since university, so it's been quite a while, but also quite good to get back into sort of an exercise of sort of going back over a book and sort of making notes and sort of getting bits and pieces and sort of covering it along. But like I say, if you too would like to sort of follow along with our wonderful little book club, then please feel free to do so, or not if the case may be. Like I say, it's very likely these books will probably rapidly plummet in price, as these types of political books often do. So mine cost about 25 quid. Like I say, is the hardback version of it. Ultimately, it will probably go into a soft cover very soon, which will be cheaper. And you can get along if we're still doing Johnson at 10. Maybe we might be at this point. Like I say, it's a pretty lofty tome, and as you can see, that's just chapter 1. So without further ado, like I say, we will be going over my thoughts, some of the stuff that was happening in sort of chapter 1, what my thoughts on it, some of the notes that I sort of made on some of the stuff that was said. And oh yeah, we'll be going over that. So yeah, if you would like to sort of help support sort of the channel, there is the Patreon page down below. There is the YouTube subscription called the Pony Club, where you can join up to that as well. If you want to sort of just donate, go do one go. Oh wow. Thank you for suffering for us. There is the buy me coffee link where you can buy me coffee, and of course there is the YouTube thank you button down below as well if you just want to donate for a one-off for the channel. So let's go and dive into the very first episode of this book club, going over chapter 1, The Rise. And I really do believe, certainly, Anthony Sheldon, of course, Raymond Newell were right to start with The Rise. I don't think, to be honest, that the way this book is shaping out and the way that they are telling the story of, well, Johnson at 10, just what happened, why it led to being such an absolute disaster. I think going over the rise of how he got there is just an important part of the story as when he was at number 10. Because as we'll be going over, some of the many incidents just on his way to the top, there could have been many points where someone could have stopped him. Someone could have pointed out just how bad Johnson really was going to be. And remember, only really Michael Gove, when he sort of very much stabbed Johnson in the back in the 2016 sort of leadership election, and even again tried to do, which we'll be getting into ultimately in a moment as well, because that's a big part of this. Yeah, holy moly. Certainly very true. So let's start off right at the beginning. So it actually starts off talking about how Johnson had these very obvious character flaws. And the fact that these character flaws were obvious right from the word go. And it starts off with the now infamous report that his former schoolmaster gave to him, saying that he was lazy and didn't feel tied to the same web of the web of how do they call it now? The whole web of responsibilities that everyone else felt that they were tied to. He felt that he was exempt from those, and that there was a very much cavalier and disregard attitude for those. So that was pretty much the first of these character flaws that we saw from Johnson, which were pretty much, um, and to be honest, so far, even just in chapter one, are constantly echoed, constantly seen, and at no point, as sort of Sheldon and Newell point out continuously, at no point did Johnson for a second stop to re-examine himself and look at his character flaws and think that, is this something I should address and re-look at? So it's quite illuminating that not once did Johnson stop and think, but these were the exact same flaws which would ultimately bring about his downfall. And of course, it starts off with his first big job, where he was the editor at the Spectator. That this was his first big moment. And it's described by some of the people who worked with him in the office was, while Johnson may have improved like the circulation of the Spectator, him running the office was pure chaos. Sometimes Johnson wouldn't even turn up. And you had the chief deputy editor who was running around constantly close to the deadline, trying to fill in the blanks for the magazine at the very last moment. And not only that, freelancers would put forward ideas and concepts for articles to Johnson, and Johnson would go, okay, yes, excellent, fantastic. So they would go off, write the article and the content, send it over to Johnson, then hear nothing. It wouldn't be published, it wouldn't be paid. And then they'd ask for feedback, or why wasn't it published? After all, you'd say it was great, amazing. They wouldn't hear anything. So this constant chaos that we saw from Johnson was very, very much there at his time when he was the editor of The Spectator. And the only reason I think he was kept in charge was because of how much he had increased the circulation, and that I think the owners at the time certainly were that opinion. So long as Johnson is sort of making money and the money is coming in, then we can afford this chaos to reign and run at the magazine. So that was, and certainly should have been, the first point at what people thought about this. But then there was something interesting that came along, and this is, of course, where Johnson was leader. Not Johnson, where Cameron and Osborne were leaders. At this point, they were in number 10. They were in sort of injuring the coalition, and Johnson saw them, and he thought, if Cameron and Osborne can do the job, then so can I. And that, from what we can tell, was the first point where he started to say, I want to be prime minister. Again, Britain's worst kept secret. Everyone knew Johnson wanted to be prime minister, something that continuously, to be honest, during the rise comes up all the time. So what does he do after that? Well, he goes on to be London mayor. He got elected as an MP after numerous times promising to the owner that he would never stand to be an MP, stood to be an MP, and then went on to try and become mayor of London, tried to get assurances from Cameron Osborne that if he didn't win, he would be sort of welcomed back, that he wouldn't have to sort of fully give up his seat unless he won. However, Johnson loved being mayor of London. And he loved, most of all, loved to put on a show. That was his first and foremost priority. He loved putting on a show. He loved being the ringmaster of the circus. And why did he love it? Well, he didn't have to really have any scrutiny. And of course, he loved to delegate. So he delegated pretty much everything to his City Hall team. Anything he didn't like, he could send it over to his City Hall team or to one of his assistants. He delegated all the time. And this is something we would see when Johnson was in at number 10. And I said before, reading this book, and I think certainly in later chapters, I'm going to be very interested to see just how much power and how much decision-making Johnson generally gave up to people like Dominic Cummings and anyone else around him. I think that's going to be really interesting to find out when we get to those later chapters. So bear that in mind for future installments of the book club. The other thing that he loved to do was he loved to pick the pockets of Osborne at the Treasury. He loved his big um, sort of projects, but these big projects required a big amount of money. So he was constantly going to Osborne, demanding money from the Treasury for London, and really we saw and is now something that is very much, I think, being re-examined, was how good was Johnson as mayor of London? Because Johnson left as mayor of London with a pretty much very high approval rating, very much from the Olympics and then sort of the post-Olympic legacy that he sort of felt that he had. And he felt that he'd done a very, very good job as mayor of London. But to be honest, a lot of people very, very much thought now have been rethinking Johnson's time as mayor of London, realizing he wasn't really that good a mayor at all. Yeah, he loved the pomp and pageantry of it all, but he really didn't do a very good job. So he took, certainly this is interesting, he took winning his second term as an endorsement of not only his greatness, but he started to eye number 10 greedily across the water. And Cameron and Oz knew of this and kept him at arm's length. And so they knew that. They intentionally kept him at arm's length, kept him away as far away as they could on purpose. That's very interesting. But this second win reinforced his idea that he was good. He was the golden boy. He was the chosen Tory to lead the Tory party into this new, fantastic, golden Churchillian age. Of course, that wasn't to be. And then, of course, in comes the story Ben Wallace. Ben Wallace, the current most popular Tory cabinet member of all people, brought Wallace back in because he saw that Johnson would be potentially a good future leader of the Tory party. However, he knew at the time it was very clear that Cameron was in charge and that Osborne was the picked successor, that Osborne was always going to be the man who would follow on from Cameron. But Wallace knew and recognized at least that Johnson had the potential to be a good potential leader. But he didn't have any backing of the MPs. So Wallace brought him back in, said, go sit on the backbenches and quietly keep a low profile as possible, build connections, build your allies for a run at number 10. And that's what we can see Johnson did. He started doing these curry nights. As you may remember, we reported not to when Liz Truss, and I'm sure this will potentially come up in the book as well, when Liz Truss was planning to also overthrow Johnson, she was having private dinners with the new 2019 intake, building these connections, building these potential alliances that would get her into number 10 as well. And they were told, oh, I'm just getting to know our new, the new intake. That's all I'm doing. Well, that's what Johnson was doing as well, especially back at that time. So now it comes, of course, on to Brexit. And we all know the story of Brexit. He didn't know which side to back. Cameron Osborne knew that Johnson would be the secret winning formula here. But Johnson really saw this whole Brexit referendum as, from what we can see in the book and the inside stories from people who were close to him from aides, that he saw it as a win-win. As far as he was concerned, if he lost as leader of the Leave campaign, then he would be able to use it as that Eurosceptic pals that he'd made to potentially back him in a upcoming future leadership contest. That's how he saw it. That's why he eventually decided to go, I think, for Leave. He saw that as his opportunity because he knew his biggest rival was Osborne. And he thought that if he backed Leave, if he went in that direction rather than back Remain, he would be able to back, or at least get enough pull enough Eurosceptic MPs over to his side to be able to get that run. And then we come on to some more stuff. So this has been reported before, but he was angry at Cummings, not just for the £350 million a week claim, but the Turkey joining the EU. Remember, Johnson, in his time as being the London mayor, had been seen as sort of a open, sort of multicultural, welcoming, liberal mayor. That claim wasn't matching with that current attitude. He was furious at this. He wanted to go not only down to London to quit, but to punch Cummings. And his aides, from what we can see with some of this report, from the interviews, took this seriously. They generally thought that Johnson was going to go down to London and just absolutely punch Cummings. And they had to tell him, no, you can't do that because it would get out. And this is, from what, at least to the first chapter, the first time, and it'll happen again in a later sort of piece when we get to it, the first time we can see that Johnson threatened violence against someone or looked as if he would go to punch someone, and his aides were and the people around him seriously thought he might do it. So even only just in the first chapter, there's 2 instances, and we'll get to the second one later, but I have to wonder whether that might become a running theme also in this book. It would be very, very interesting if that does end up becoming something, a regular theme in this book. And of course, now we get on to the result. And from what we can, again, tell from the results, he was generally shocked at the result, generally shocked. He had no idea. And then, of course, came the realization, as we've all seen, that he knew that they had no plan. He had not expected to win the referendum. And then came the Cameron resignation. This was something else that really shocked him. And even though this was something he wanted, because he wanted Cameron to resign so that he could take the crown, all this pomp and pageantry that he'd hoped for, in assuming his rightful place as leader of the Conservative Party, once he saw Cameron resign, he was genuinely shocked by it because he didn't expect it. And then this is where things start to get interesting, because now we get onto the Gove Boris relationship that sort of happened. And previous to this, Osborne, Cameron, and Gove, that was the triumvirate of British politics for a long time. But as we've talked about before, Gove sort of didn't like the fact that Cameron was pulling the party too much in a centrist right direction. He felt that the party needed that bit of centrist pull, but Cameron had taken the party a bit too far, that it was now a bit too centrist, that, he needed to pull it back. And Cameron had sort of rejected this idea, hence why he ended up backing Leave. So the idea was that Johnson wanted to run and that Gove would back him and that he would be the guy who ran the Treasury. But even Michael Gove was like, well, I can't add up. I can't do math. And Cummings said to him at the time, don't worry, we can find people to do it for you. And even then, when Johnson found out that Gove had stabbed him in the back, according to an advisor, he actually cried when Gove announced he was running, and he'd felt betrayed. And this would affect him into not trusting anyone later. Because Johnson, throughout his career, has had very little trust of others. But apparently, this shattered that trust so much. Not only did he not end up trusting advisors, he did not end up trusting former friends, he did not end up even trusting his current friends. And then, of course, he dithered about should or should he not run in 2016 for leader. And eventually, he decided not to. And he would end up massively regretting it. But an advisor said this would sow the seeds for future problems because it instilled in him the idea he should never resign. And remember everything what happened in 2022, where everyone knew this was the end and Johnson would just not resign. Everyone was like, well, what's it going to take to get Johnson out of number 10? Everyone knows it's the end. It's over. Who's going to finally pull him out of the bunker? That's where all this started. In the 2016 leadership race, he decided after he had dithered so much, he would never, ever resign again. And it would instill in this belief that he would always make the right decision. And then, of course, in came May. And May, from what we can tell, knew that Johnson was at least a big player. And she wanted him in the Foreign Office, but she told him, I know that there's two Borises. There's the serious intellectual Boris, and then there's the clown Boris. I want you to be serious. And she had him pegged from day one. And I always think it will be the biggest mystery. Why on earth did she recognize that Johnson was just not a serious character, but she still brought him into the cabinet in number 10? I think that will probably be one of the biggest mysteries ever. I really, really think it will be. But actually, we're just going to rewind the clock, because after that, before obviously May came in, because I missed a point and I want to go and cover it. But so before that, after Gove himself had been knocked out of the leadership contest, Gove apparently went to see Boris. He apparently went to try and rebuild bridges. And he went into Johnson's MP office in number 10, and there was an aide there. And the aide thought, oh, do you want me to go? And initially, Johnson looked at him and told him to stay because he wasn't sure whether Johnson might punch Gove, which, again, is the second example that I was talking about, that Johnson not only might punch someone, but aides were worried enough to try and calm him down, or at least stay in the room to do that. And eventually the aide left the room, but it was not an easy meeting. There was a loud argument and everyone sort of knew about it. So Johnson and Gove did not make up. There was still a lot of animosity and anger between them that still exists to this day. But anyway, we move back to when, like I say, May had sort of given him the Foreign Office position, told him, you've got to be serious. However, within a month, Johnson had become completely disillusioned. Not only had he had the negotiating Brexit taken away from him by David Davis, but he couldn't even negotiate any trade deals because that had been taken away from him as well. So he regretted it. He liked going on some of these trips, and would frustrate his advisors because he would have other diplomats and other leaders numbers on his phone on speed dial, and he would just phone them up, and it would drive other diplomats and other people that were working with him in absolute furiousness because he was just so unprofessional about it. It was a nightmare to apparently try and handle them. So he grew very much disillusioned within his first month, and he absolutely learned to loathe May. He did not like her. And then 9 months after, there was this infamous now Sun leak, where May had said she would not back airstrikes in Syria. And at that point, that is when May and Johnson really went to war. And then there was the big thing over should Johnson or should he or should not resign over Chequers. And initially, Johnson thought that he wouldn't resign over the Chequers deal, but he was convinced by Cummings that he should, because he said it would suit you better if you resign. And he was very apparently depressed after he had resigned, but he didn't have long to wait, because obviously not soon after, May would be in very, very much big trouble. And obviously this would then result in the 2019 leadership contest. And Johnson was desperate to get revenge on Gove. But his first target was Dominic Raab. So he went, we'll take out Dominic Raab first. And then once he knocked out Raab, his team knew that he could beat Hunt very easily. They knew, like, as long as Johnson got to the final two, they knew Johnson would win the vote of the membership. So it was about getting to the final two. And boy, did they know that. But what was also sold to many MPs at the time was this Faustian bargain. Many Tory MPs were fully aware of what Johnson was really like, but they decided to do this Faustian pact because, remember, the Brexit impasse was causing constant nothing but headaches. And then, of course, there was the threat, who could beat Corbyn? And Johnson was sold to Conservative MPs as the only guy who could beat Corbyn. And so many Conservative MPs went into a very Faustian pact, knowing full well that they didn't like Johnson, but he was the only guy who could beat Corbyn. And then I love this quote. So this was it. On the cusp of Rome, Johnson panicked. He had got everything he'd ever wanted. He had won the leadership contest. He was on his way into number 10. But he panicked. Why? Because he had done absolutely no preparation whatsoever. Every other prime minister who's ever been at that stage, going into number 10, has done months of preparation beforehand, sounding out people who would go into them as a team into number 10. Johnson had no plan. He hadn't even built a team going into number 10 at that point, and he was panicking. And even then, right at the very last moment, he decided to bring in Cummings. The very last moment, against the advice of some of his advisors, because he felt that Cummings might be the only guy he could, well, maybe even trust, or at least worked with him before. So he felt that he knew and understood how Cummings might work. On that, the only person who ever really know that, of course, is Boris Johnson. And of course, that comes and brings us to the end of chapter 1. So chapter 2, Brexit, we'll be covering next time at Johnson at number 10. But let me know what you think of chapter 1. What have you read chapter 1? Was there anything that I missed in chapter 1 that you thought was interesting that I sort of should have talked about and covered? Like I say, to be honest, there's a lot of information here, which is part of the reason why I got it. But yeah, what do you think to some of the stuff that I've talked about here? Do you agree? Do you disagree? Do you think there's something else that I missed in sort of the talk and discussion at Johnson number 10? But oh wow, already chapter 1 is shaping up to be very, very interesting. Very, very interesting indeed. So, like I say, thank you very much for joining us today on our very first book club, looking at chapter 1, The Rise. Like I say, next time we'll be covering chapter 2, Brexit. And we will see how Johnson handled, well, Brexit. So until then, we'll see you all next time.